where I will meet leaders who say, oh, we have members of our team who were born in a different era, or, it's fine.
Yeah.
We can
Yeah.
just let bad behavior go because, it's not like they're going to change. And then I have worked with and also spoken at organizations where that's not going to fly, where there is an intrinsic value that the organization has placed on behaviors that model growth, that model failure but learning from it, that model who you are today with a fixed mindset isn't who you're going to be tomorrow if you're willing to learn.
Welcome to DEI Career Conversations. I'm your host, the DEI Career Coach, Andrea G. Tatum. In this episode, I sat down with best-selling author and inclusion strategist, Ruchika Tulshyan. We talked about why intersectionality is so critical in this work. We also talked about how leaders can focus on organizational behaviors to help move DEI forward within their companies. And she shared with us how having a growth mindset actually led to her writing one of the most viewed articles on the Harvard Business Review website, all about impostor syndrome. So if you're thinking about making a pivot into DEI, you do not want to miss this episode. And don't forget to like, share, and comment so I can continue bringing you more conversations just like this one. And check out DEIcareer.com to learn about my courses and coaching programs for professionals who are thinking about how they can pivot their passion for DEI into a career. All right, let's get into it. Y'all, I am so very excited for today's conversation. I have my amazing guest with me here today. Ruchika, thank you for being here. Please just start us off by telling us all about your professional journey from a journalist to being a DEI author, being an inclusion strategist. Just dive in and tell us all the things.
Ooh, all the things. I think I want to lead with a couple of things. I think the most important part of my identity is that I've lived in many different countries and been part of many different cultures. And that has really informed everything I've wanted to do. So I think there's that. And then the second part of it is storytelling. I'm a deeply interested and curious, maybe a little too curious about people and systems and ideas and cultures. So those two things have been very formative throughout my life. And indeed, I started my career as a business journalist. I think this time in history is really interesting because you hear that things happen in cycles, and really covering 2008 and 9, the financial crisis of that time as a journalist, and then now being able to look at some of those similar rumblings, hopefully never to that level, but similar situations in my work as a DEI practitioner and inclusion strategist, someone who has written a book really looking at folks who are really marginalized by systems in our workplaces today. It's been a really interesting time, I would say. So really just a quick roundup is I made the transition from journalism into the technology industry just about a decade ago. I think the technology industry really laid bare for me some of the big challenges that we see that are, universal in the sense that there are systems of oppression at play, whether you look at, the financial industry or journalism, indeed the media industry. But I think there's something about the technology industry that felt really just very isolating as a woman of color because of that cognitive dissonance of, on the one hand, you're very innovative, supposedly very high growth, you're supposed to be very meritocratic. There are opportunities for all good ideas rise to the top is what you hear. You fail fast, all of that. And then the cognitive dissonance of actually being a woman of color in the technology industry. And observing more than anything the experiences of other marginalized, even more marginalized women of color in the technology industry. And so I made a very unplanned change from journalism and tech communication into what I'm doing right now. At that time, it didn't feel like there was really a blueprint or a playbook for it. Most of the DEI practitioners I had known, and I didn't even know if DEI practitioner was what I wanted to do, or even that sort of thing existed, right? Like, was there even a role that existed like that? And making that transition about 10 years ago, completely not knowing what I was doing, where I was going, and to be able to be at this side of the journey of taking a lot of leaps of faith, obviously having the privilege to do so. But I feel really lucky, and I get to meet amazing people and learn from amazing people like you, Andrea, which has been a constant every time we've interacted. Every time I've seen work you put out, I'm like, okay, yes, this is what makes the hard days in this work a little less hard.
Yeah, same. And thank you for that. Like for a little bit of background, even just on our relationship, like I met Ruchika through a mutual friend, and I was telling that friend, like, I'm really looking for somebody to talk about DEI who has a understanding about being in tech and can really speak to the nuances of that. And my colleague, shout out to Steve, was like, hey, you've got to meet this person. And luckily, like days later, we ended up being at a conference together, and I got to hear you speak on a panel with several other women, one of whom was Minda Harts, and she had just put out her book. You had your first book out around diversity, and I was just like in awe of the women on that panel who could, like you just talked about, gave that power of storytelling and how impactful it was. As I looked at the rest of the audience, one, it was very validating for other women of color who were sitting and listening to your stories. And I think we don't give enough credit to how important validation is in this, because it can feel like, is it just me? Is it, and two, for the handful of white people, members of the global majority, like they were just like, oh, huh. It's like you just see these little light bulbs going up. And so like that, and from there, we've built such a beautiful relationship. And I'm so appreciative of you being a confidant, a mentor, but also something that I not only see you obviously talk about in your work, but that you actually do. You model this. You show up as a sponsor. Like, I know that you have sent more people my way. You speak my name in rooms. And like, tell me a little bit about, how did you come to realizing, like, not only is it something to talk about, but something that you model in your practice as well, something like mentorship and sponsorship?
Thank you so much, Andrea. And I feel the same way. And talk about sponsorship, because what had happened, if you recall, is the opportunity that you tapped me for was truly the first. It was the first virtual engagement that I did as we were getting into the COVID-19 pandemic. It was one of those moments where I was just like, here's this thing, it's booked, and we don't know if we're going to be virtual or not. And I remember this feeling of like dread. Like, obviously there was like the global dread, the health dread, the like failure of government dread, like literally all the things, having a 3-year-old at that time, like all of these things. And then I remember having our meetings with each other, and it just felt validated. It just felt like I am not alone in navigating, wanting systems change, dreaming of a world where more of us could be seen and have our stories told. But the pandemic wasn't going to take that away from us. The pandemic wouldn't change, or it wouldn't reduce the momentum that so many of us had been building, sometimes in silos. So I do want to say that, and I really appreciate the way you sponsored me in that moment, and continue to do so. And I think the importance of sponsorship, sometimes I think the challenge is people think sponsorship, or even, allyship is the one where I kind of struggle a little bit, is that you affirm someone. Validation is super important, but like you sort of talk to someone and you're like, oh, you're doing well in your career, or you've written this great book, or you have this amazing, podcast and show. And that's wonderful. And it's a very sort of one-on-one, which has its place in time, and it has its place in a person's life and career. But from a professional standpoint, and especially as you are trying to make an impact and make momentum and make change, what you really need is sponsorship. And you need someone to speak your name in rooms that you would never be part of, right? And you may be left out because you're from an underestimated, underrepresented identity, especially as women of color. It could be for a variety of reasons that you aren't represented there. And I think that we forget, or maybe we aren't even made aware of how important sponsorship is. And the research show that especially in corporations, the majority, we know this, that 80+% of corporations, especially when you get to VP level and above, are staffed by white men. And research shows that 3/4 of senior leaders sponsor, junior folks of the same race and gender as them. So it becomes this sort of self-fulfilling prophecy and vicious cycle of sponsoring only the same identities. The same people sponsor the same people. So for me, what I'm really hoping and dreaming of in terms of systems, both systems that will change, and to try and do my part to make change on an individual level, is to sponsor women of color and sponsor women specifically who don't look like me, women of color who are not South Asian necessarily, because that's where I think our collective liberation lies, in us sponsoring each other, speaking our names in rooms, amplifying each other, not just on that one-on-one support level, which is wonderful and has its place, but for us to make the type of change and impact we want to, we need to very actively be sponsoring each other.
I love that breakdown. Like, it's so critical. It's something I talk about in my work all the time. So thank you for just kind of walking us through kind of your thoughts on that. And so, like, in thinking about your approach, I heard you say, right, just trying to think even more broadly outside of self. And as a Black woman, I try to do the same. I'm like, while it is critical to focus so much of this work from that standpoint as a Black woman, I also acknowledge there's limitations in that. And so I'd love to hear a little bit, like, I know you and I personally have talked a little bit about this, but like, what was your journey from your first book to your second book and thinking about who you wanted to center? And like, I just want to shout out, I see you've got it in the back, but like, I have it here, Inclusion on Purpose. And specifically it says an intersectional approach to creating a culture of belonging at work. And I love that you talked about that intersectional approach. So just talk to me a little bit about like your journey from that first book to thinking about that intersectional approach in your second book.
Thank you. And there is definitely a part of me that really wanted to right a lot of the wrongs that set out in my first book, The Diversity Advantage, Fixing Gender Inequality in the Workplace, because the focus that I put on gender inequality in the workplace was sort of a general, women are struggling in the workplace, in corporate workplaces around the world, which is very much true.
Yeah.
It did not take an intersectional approach. And I think so much, I've done some deep work and thought processing around this and some healing around it. And a big part of it was having to decolonize my mind and decolonize and uncondition myself from systems of white supremacy, which told me as an immigrant woman of color that my success lay only in upholding both white supremacy and dominance, and as well as anti-Blackness. And I think that is something that is a very deep work that more immigrants and diaspora, especially Asians, need to do in this country and around the world. Really, I've had good conversations around this. And so in some way, to try and right that wrong, to really learn in public around some of the mistakes I made in writing a book about gender inequality in the workplace that did not take a deliberately intersectional approach. I'm really proud and really glad that I was able to kind of have that opportunity to do that and learn in public and put forward through storytelling and data and case studies, what it's like to really create a future where, again, our collective success, our collective wins as women of color, as the fact that, you know, here's when I actually wrote the book, like, here's the reality. My experience as an Indian immigrant, Singaporean Indian immigrant woman is going to be different from your experience as a Black woman, for sure. And the fact that we have both entered the workplace as non-white women is going to make a huge impact on our workplace experiences. There's no denying this. There's good data to back this up.
Absolutely.
And there's, again, it's the both and. It's very, very important to be able to speak about your stories from your vantage point. If I am ever invited to talk about, you know, what is the Black experience in the workplace, I will never be the person speaking. I will never be the lead speaker in that forum, for example, right? I can use the data. I can say the data suggests this, the data shows this, my anecdotal experience, my evidence and interviews show blah, 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 and that's it. Mm-hmm. And where I think, again, success lies, our collective liberation lies in us banding together, understanding that there are unique experiences we have had as women of color. And so I use it as a social and political identity. Not in a big part of white supremacy has been to divide us and to oversimplify our categorizations, right? And to oversimplify the multitude of beautiful identities, the intersecting identities that make us who we are. And sometimes in doing that, what has happened as a result is we don't realize how many struggles are similar and how much, for example, me being vocal about the existence of anti-Blackness and me being vocal about advocating for a future where there's Black liberation, Black joy, Black justice is very much going to benefit me too. And so my hope is that we can do more of this work without being, you know, without saying to each other, and, you know, I know, Andrea, you and I are totally in sync on this, but I hope what we can do is we can realize how much stronger we can be together if we focus on uplifting, especially those who are most marginalized in our society and our workplaces today.
Oh, I love it. This is why I'm so excited to have you, because you laid it out so beautifully. And I love having those conversations, but why I also really love your work is because you do bring so many aspects of your own identity. You talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion from a global lens, whereas many of us, right, we bring our lived experience as Americans who were born and raised here, but right, you just talked about all the nuances that go into it, and I think that is so critical, and why I love, you know, reading what you write on LinkedIn. You've recently been posting about what's happened in Seattle and the caste systems, and like I think that it's easy for those things to not get the shine when there's so many things happening, unfortunately, in the world. So I love that approach. And so I want to keep talking about your book, because if you couldn't tell, I mean, I've got like so many pieces of paper and highlights, and I really think about your book as like a resource that I can constantly go back to. It wasn't a book that I was like, let me just read it one time and like, yeah, it sits on my bookshelf because I constantly go back to it. But in the book, you talk about organizational behaviors, and specifically how those organizational behaviors can drive inclusion within a workplace. And I love that frame of thinking about DEI. So what are specifically a couple of organizational behaviors that new DEI professionals may need to consider when they're thinking about, like, how do I help a company become more diverse, equitable, and inclusive? Because I just don't think we talk about from that organizational lens quite enough. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah. And, you know, as you can tell, I love those spaces of the both and. And so when I actually wrote the book, I really, and what's funny is when I get feedback from a lot of white leaders and white readers that the first part of the book, which is really about the internal work that needs to be done, I write about, privilege. I write about addressing your own privilege, making changes into your own mindset to be more inclusive and developing an inclusion mindset. So a lot of white readers tell me that part is really important and resonated a lot with them. And when I speak to women of color, there are actually people who are like, the first part of the book was a little slow and then it picked up, and I really loved the organizational behavior parts. And I think what I really appreciate about the both and in this is I absolutely think that people, all of us, and even when I write about privilege, I specifically talk about my own privilege, something that I learned about and have seen modeled beautifully from Ijeoma Ulo, who wrote this gorgeous, painful, hard, and super, super compelling forward. I feel so lucky for the book. And so I really lead privilege discussions with, and that internal work discussions with, like, here's the mistakes I made. Here are the parts where I didn't even think about my privilege. Caste is a great example of, here in the Seattle area, we have banned caste discrimination, which is incredible. And for many years, despite being off, Indian origin and having a caste assigned to me and being born of a certain caste, I never even thought about it because that was part of my privilege, right? So there's that. I think from the organizational behavior standpoint, of course, organizations are made up of people and are made up of leaders, and there are people who have more influence and power in shaping the culture within that organization. And so for me, when I think about organizational behaviors to be more inclusive, there are behaviors, there are policies and actions and practices that are really important. Pay equity is something I talk a lot about in the book, talk a lot about making sure that you give effective feedback, you receive effective feedback. And then there are overarching behaviors, like approaches that define the culture. So a culture of psychological safety is really, really important. Simply put, do people from underestimated identities, like women of color, do we have the option and the ability to speak up, to challenge status quo, to take risks, and to fail without fear of retribution? And the reality is most of us don't, right? But in an organization where the behaviors modeled prioritize psychological safety, that creates a more inclusive environment. Another one is an organization which prioritizes the growth mindset, which is kind of related as well to that. Are we an organization where we believe you're a fixed person? And I really see this in my work in inclusion strategy and consulting, where I will meet leaders who say, oh, we have members of our team who were born in a different era, or, it's fine. We can just let bad behavior go because, it's not like they're going to change. And then I have worked with and also spoken at organizations where that's not going to fly, where there is an intrinsic value that the organization has placed on behaviors that model growth, that model failure but learning from it, that model who you are today with a fixed mindset isn't who you're going to be tomorrow if you're willing to learn. And so that's an example of an organizational behavior or value that can make the biggest difference when it comes to inclusion. And I think, again, it's one of those things where, yes, the individuals who have an outsized influence in shaping that, unfortunately today, are mostly dominant group cis straight white men. And I think where there has been change, where there is a diversity of senior leadership, where there is a diversity of creating a culture of different people influencing the culture, you really see that growth mindset coming forward.
That is profound. Like, I love those things because, it's funny to me that, you just laid out some, I won't say simple in that they're easy to do, but like, they're not necessarily hard or new ideas in terms of like how to give feedback. But it's really interesting that when we talk about what diversity, equity, and inclusion is and the work that is DEI, one thing that I have actually found is that many leaders don't connect the dots between DEI and organizational behaviors. They believe that DEI work is strictly like kind of what you were talking about, like right in the beginning of the book. We're just going to talk about power. We're just going to talk about privilege. We're just going to talk about identity. and they don't quite get to that like change part and how it applies. And so when I show up in an organization, I'm like, yeah, how are your leaders giving feedback? How are they setting up and preparing meetings? What does it look like for someone to, grow in your company? Do they have a defined career path? They're like, can you just come in and talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion? I'm like, well, yeah, that's the conversation we're having. And
you're so right. You're so right. And I think the work that has been very difficult is, moving from that simplification, oversimplification of we'll have a book club, or we will have one talk, or we will all, post a black square to show solidarity. All of those very performative measures, or one and done. Some are performative, some are one and done, without realizing that everything today, every single function of the way that both how we operate as individuals within society as well as within an organization, every single part of that has a DEI lens to it, and our policies. It's both parts. Everything has a DEI implication, right? Whether
absolutely
who you hire, where you post your jobs, who you advance. Do you have an offboarding process? Why are people of color leaving? Where are they going? What are the issues? Like across the board, who are the vendors you're working with? What are your policies like? We know, even when we think about like benefits, we know that for so many people of color who have been so deeply disadvantaged by a lot of the systems that have been in place here for, decades, if not centuries, every single thing matters more. A comprehensive benefits policy matters that much more if you don't have generational wealth, right? Having strong, I know in this country, healthcare, which was a shock to me, but healthcare is tied to your employer. It matters so much more, right? It matters so much more if you're a person of color. If you're the first person in your family to have graduated college and had a job, where you had good healthcare benefits, like it's so much more, right? The stakes are so much higher. And I think
you can keep digging into that and keep digging into that and saying like, okay, how inclusive are those benefits? Are we thinking about, our caregivers? Are we thinking about people who are, who made transition, right, while they're at our company? Do our benefits create space and for that? Like all of those little things, which aren't little at all, matter when creating benefits that are inclusive, that create equity, like you said, that create generational wealth, all of those things. I want to just pivot slightly because, like I said, I know we can talk about all of the things that go into this. Yes. But, I work a lot with people who are saying like, I want to make that pivot into DEI. They're coming from careers, whether it's in academia, they're coming from maybe being a lawyer, they're whatever it is. Maybe they've been doing marketing in tech. One of the number one things I hear from people is that they have this sense of fear about, I want to apply, I want to do this job, but they feel this sense of what they identify as impostor syndrome. And I mean, your work, you and Jodi Ambury have done this work around imposter syndrome. You've been published in the Harvard Business Review. You have spoken with Brené Brown. I lived for that interview with you all and Brené Brown because it just felt so like real. But talk to me about that work. Like, one, how did you all come to decide to do work on imposter syndrome? And then can you tell me how you think like aspiring DEI professionals can shift their thoughts around imposter syndrome?
Oh my gosh, all the things. And at this point, I feel like I should have both and tattooed on me somewhere.
You and me both. It's my favorite.
Right?
Like I'm always like, it's a yes and, because like
yes and.
I used to work in theater. It's an improv thing. So I'm like, yes and, it's my favorite.
It's the best. And it really makes such a difference. It's transformational if you can take that approach in life, whatever you do. So what's interesting is when I started what began as sort of the very early journey of making the transition, essentially I was ready to leave a job that didn't serve me or an industry that felt very toxic. And I was leaping into the abyss because I was really worried about my health, right? I was like at that point where I was just like, I don't know what it's going to look like. And I was really young. Like it didn't make sense what was happening in my body. And so when I leapt into the abyss, at that time, there was no formalized approach to DEI anywhere, right? Like you were either an HR professional, and maybe if you worked for a forward-thinking Fortune 500, there was a chief inclusion or diversity officer who was most likely someone who had had a lot of HR experience and had been put in. And I didn't even think of that as a career path, and I didn't know that it even existed. And so a lot of what has got me to this point has been building the boat as I sail. And I think at the same time, having a lot of rejection and being very adaptable. And maybe that's a good thing. Like I've just been very adaptable about, I when I started Candour, my thought was, let me take my journalism and communication love and passion and my real interest and research that I've been trying to do on inclusion, diversity, and equity. And let's see if there's a way to make inclusion communications a thing. Like maybe this is like, people can come to me and they'll say like, could you, maybe audit the speech, or could you help us audit like the way we communicate, communication guidelines, like things that I had done in the tech industry and other industries, certainly in my background in journalism. And nobody was interested. Zero. I pitched heavily. I was like, listen, I'm like running out of, I left my last job with 3/4 of my stock options on the table. Like I have, I am privileged to have health insurance tied to my spouse's, but like the money's going to run out. Now what? And nobody was interested. But what was interesting is people started saying, well, could you help us like maybe look into our policies and create a more, like just help us look at our policies. And I started working with a data scientist. We started doing this really, it felt like a real, like we talk about entrepreneurship, especially here in the Seattle area, as like, 2 dudes in a garage building, like that is, it kind of felt like that, like not 2 dudes, like,
Right.
a queer non-binary person and myself and a woman of color. We were like, okay, like what are we doing? Let's get this started. And I really, really look back at that time as definitely one where I felt a lot of like uncertainty and fear about like what I was doing, and like just from the sense of like I need to learn more, I need to expand myself more. But I had that growth mindset of like, I don't know, but I will learn, and I'm going to go and talk to the people who have been so generous with me and learn a lot from them and make sure that obviously they get their flowers and all of that. I think where the imposter syndrome, the start of it really started, this thread that I started pulling was, it started in the tech industry, where I would hear a lot of especially white women talk about imposter syndrome as something they had to overcome to be leaders. And it was a narrative I never identified with. It just didn't make sense, right? Because I've always had that little bit of that growth mindset of like, I may not know everything, but I'll learn. And there are things I know. And what I would find again and again is every time I would try and put ideas forward, I would face pushback, especially as the only woman of color in the department I was working in. And so fast forward to summer of 2020, Jody Ann and I, we had only met like once or twice before that. We do a socially distanced lunch out here in the Seattle area. We're like, masks, no masks, like what do we do? So we're like outdoors. There's like bees flying around everywhere here where we're eating at our favorite Vietnamese restaurant, my favorite Vietnamese restaurant. And I say to her, I was like, something that's been really hard for me in this pandemic is I keep getting marketed women's conferences where speakers are going to talk about imposter syndrome. And I'm like, it's a global pandemic. Like, what do you think? And she's like, imposter syndrome is BS. And then goes into
that sounds just like Jody.
It sounds exactly like Jody Ann.
That's Jody Ann. Yep.
That's Jody Ann to T. And we, you know, again, like we've talked about our story, but it was just incredible to meet someone who really had seen, again, speak of validation, right? Like who was seeing the world from my perspective as well, right? After being told for so long, like, oh no, what's holding you back is imposter syndrome. What's holding women as a collective back is imposter syndrome. What's holding people of color back is imposter syndrome. And finally, there was someone else who could look me in the eye at that time, because remember, like it was like 5 months into the pandemic, really lonely period in history and time. And everything just clicked into place. And so we wrote the piece, we co-wrote the piece, didn't even think about like what the future would look like, didn't even know how people would respond to it. And honestly, it's just been incredible. And I'm just so glad, because it just reminds you that like by no means were we the only people feeling this way. So when I, to kind of then dovetail back to your like original question, as you can see, I can like go on, and I need a little bit of corralling, especially on this topic. This is the one where I'm like, ah, but I'd say to bring this back to how aspiring DEI professionals, I think there's something that makes us and calls us to this work that is, especially those who are really doing it with their hearts, because as I've heard it being said, this is hard work and it's truly heart work.
That's
so
right.
If you are being called to this because it's heart work, and especially for those people who, and again, when I made the transition, there was no such thing. So it was not lucrative. There was no opportunity. You kind of had to create it as you went along, if there was anything. Now I feel like things have shifted a little bit, where it's, I've seen some people rush in where I question the motives. But largely for those of us who feel a bit of that, like I'm called to this, I really want to do this. The reason why I think that imposter syndrome feeling, or those imposter feelings, those feelings of like, I don't know what I'm doing, they come in, is because for so long, most of us have experienced not belonging. We have experienced being told your point of view doesn't belong, it doesn't matter, it's not true. We may have gaslit ourselves to cope. We may have experienced gaslighting where we worked or where we lived. And so that feeling of, I don't belong here, I'm not sure, is totally normal. It's totally valid. Do not call it imposter syndrome. It is not something that is wrong with you. It is something that you are working through after so long of being told your points of view and your expertise isn't valid. You're working through that to get to the other side of finding yourself, your authentic self. And I think that is the connection that is missing and was missing for so long in the imposter syndrome narrative.
Yeah. You talk about it like as a diagnosis, right? Like in your article, like people were like giving it like, oh, you've got it. Like it's something you've been diagnosed with. When I love how you reframed it. It's something you're working through. And I think that anybody who's experiencing change, it's very normal to have fear, to have those questions. But like you said, it's all of the other like systemic things on top of that the system has been working against you for so long that you are having to reframe how you think about it. And so that's so much of what I love doing as like the DEI career coach, is just really helping people to understand like, no, you've gained all of these valuable skills in other things that you've done. You talked about how as a journalist, storytelling was so important for you. How does that show up in the work that you do? Like really thinking hard about like, oh yeah, I am a good storyteller. Check. How do I put that as a skill? So I love how you all talk about that. And I will link it below the HBR article. I will link the Brené Brown conversation, because I just love all of that and really want people to just dive in and think about reframing their mindset. You've talked so much about having a growth mindset as well. And I think it's something that we actively have to work towards to have that kind of a mindset. So I really appreciate that. So as we're kind of wrapping up, one of the things I'd love to just note, like, in addition to having a growth mindset, in addition to some of the things that we've already talked about, what is one piece of advice that you would give to someone who is an aspiring DEI professional, as someone who is a consultant day in and day out? Like, you are talking to the folks and trying to really drive that change. So based on what you see as a consultant, what is a piece of advice that you would give, especially to someone thinking about going in-house as a DEI professional?
You have to build your tribe. You have to build a tribe of people who will lift you up, because again, as I mentioned, this is hard and hard work. I think if you plan to go in-house, it's very important to identify those who will practice allyship for you, as I've said often. I see allyship, and I use ally really as a verb, not a noun. And I think for folks going in-house, it's really important to understand who is going to practice allyship, who's going to have your back, because you are going to be tasked with a lot of really difficult work and difficult conversations, no matter how progressive the organization is, and it could be in any industry. I have seen real challenges in industries that are supposed to be, as selfless as nonprofit and mission-driven as, philanthropy. And I've seen great work done from like very, very, even financial institutions, which are very clearly profit-driven, but understand how much and why DEI has to be such an integral part of their work. So I think making sure that you have a very strong in-house tribe, people who really show up for you, people who can really, re-up what you're saying, amplify and sponsor is really important, in addition to building a wonderful team. And if you decide to go the consulting route, same goes, looking for like-minded professionals, folks who are ready to mentor you. Obviously, Andrea, the wealth of resources you put out there is such a gift to our community. And I just think what it would have been like to be in this space 10 years ago and have this level of generosity and availability of resources the way you've put out, it would have been transformative. It would have saved me a lot of heartache over the years, but I'm glad we're connected now. But I think that's very important. I think one of the things that often gets left out in this conversation is how much abundance of opportunity there is in DEI, because I can, and I have, and this is the difficult part of it. Sometimes you see people operating from the mentality of scarcity and that there's not enough roles and there's not enough jobs and there's, I think that is a function of white supremacy trying to keep us apart. But again, to do this work transformationally and in a way that's really going to make lasting, sustainable, effective change over, years and decades, and maybe, who knows, even centuries, depending on the organization, you have to build together and build strongly together. And I think that's a part of the conversation that gets missed and left out, honestly.
Yeah. I mean, like for me, I always talk about like find your champions. Like
Yes.
when people say like, what's the first thing that I should do if I'm, getting in role, especially if you're like the head of or a chief diversity officer, I'm like, find the champions in every single department. Know who's going to really rally for you, because you're having to literally change things. Again, it's at that organizational level. And if you don't know who your champions are in your sales department, in your marketing department, it's going to be really, really hard to make this change at an organizational level, because as a DEI professional, you aren't doing this alone. So much of what you're doing is influencing people. And so it's your power of influence, but also the power of those champions that you have, who are going to be able to help create transformation. And that's what it ultimately, for me, that's what it comes down to. It's like, how do we work together to be transformative in this work? Because it, like you said, it's hard work and it's hard work. I think I say that in every single episode. It is hard work
So
and
hard.
it is hard work. So
So
yeah.
hard. One more thing, Andrea, which I think
Yeah.
is sometimes, I hope and pray that for everyone who makes this transition, you find champions in both in your own community and outside your community, right? It is really painful when someone who looks like you and has similar shared identities isn't a champion. And I think for some of us, we have to be prepared for that, And I think
Yeah.
when we look for champions, absolutely, there's an opportunity to build and bring community together of people who shared identities. And I think sometimes you'll find champions in very unlikely places. And being open to that is also very much part of this. And I say this because it's interesting. With Inclusion on Purpose, undoubtedly, I have had vocal women of color champions. There is no doubt that the reason why the book is in some people's hands is because of the relentless championing of women of color. And I don't want to short sell that at all. I think sometimes in organizational dynamics, because most organizations were built on structures of competitiveness and late stage capitalism and the idea that there's only room for one, sometimes you can really see that dynamic play out. And so it's important to build a tribe. And sometimes those people in your tribe may not look like you. They may not have shared identities. They may not have lived experiences. Maybe they make mistakes that are embarrassing or humiliating, or maybe even to the point of, being true exclusionary behaviors. And I think that sometimes the greatest champions can be those people too.
Yeah. Ooh, I got the goosies, just like all of it, because that is so real. And I mean, there's that phrase, all skin folk ain't kin folk. It is real, because it is so easy to, like you said, give into that scarcity mindset, and the fact that we've all been conditioned by these systems of oppression. We have really been told that, there are people who have the pull up as you climb mentality, and there are some people who have like the kick them down while I climb mentality, and you've got to kind of figure out how to navigate that. And it's a hard feeling when you're like, I'm in this work, I'm doing it. And then like the people who you think are about to be your champions, or the other people who are about to like rah the work, are just like, no, I'm good. I've made it. I've arrived. So what are we talking about? Like that, to me, when I've had that conversation with someone, especially like maybe a man of color, then you're just like, okay, let me rethink my whole world just a little bit. Because how do I
approach of impostor syndrome? Yeah. When it
like,
comes from one of your own, you're like, wait, what? Did I make that up? Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. But it is the fact that, right, we're all coming from different places. We're all approaching this work at different points in our own journey. And so it is a difficult thing to navigate, but I love it. Like you said, find your people, find the ones who are going to be champions, and rely on them, and just like push forward with those folks to the best of your ability. And hopefully everybody else will, that's the goal. Everybody else will get on board, but you work hard with those folks. So,
and then
Ruchika,
rest. And then rest. Rest when you can. Last point, rest when you can.
Please, yes. Yeah, I mean, we just as before we started recording, we talked about like the importance of that, of rest. And I think one thing I was just telling as we were coming on, I was saying like I finally have had a little bit of space for the first time in a very long time to actually rest. But even in that, I've been really having to do the self-work. I love like the nap ministry online, because it is like, how do I unlearn this idea that I have to earn this rest? And it's like, I did earn it, like in everything that I do, but like that, yes. So rest as a part of your self-care practice, because as you are doing this work, it is easy to burn out, to work yourself to the point of, I have people who have called me and said, Andrea, I'm sick. I'm about to be in the hospital. I'm having to take, leave from my work because this work can be that hard and it's that personal. So yes, 100% rest when you can. With that, I mean, that's the mic drop moment. I so appreciate you. I appreciate everything that you do in this work and your approach to it, and always for including me in the conversation and just being such a big part of my own DEI career journey. So thank you for being here, Ruchika. I'm going to link everything, especially the book and all of your work below. But where else can people find you online?
The book.
The book. Perfect. Yes.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I'm so overwhelmed by the response. So thank you so much to have this opportunity to talk about myself and my approach. It means so much, Andrea, especially with someone as, an expert like yourself. It's incredible. So thank you.
Far from it. I'm just learning every day. That is how I grow. So awesome. Thank you so much. I hope you enjoyed this episode of DEI Career Conversations. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so that you know as soon as new episodes are live. Also, if you'd like to learn more about our brand new program, be sure to check out the links below or visit DEIcareer.com and look at our courses. This new course is so exciting because not only are we going to help support you as a job seeker thinking about pivoting your passion into a career into DEI, but we're also going to make sure that you have the tools and resources you need in order to learn how to create data-informed strategies for DEI, how to create metrics, how to make sure that you know how to do the work of DEI by getting unprecedented insights from DEI professionals who are doing this work day in and day out. So I'm so excited about it. I hope that you'll join us. We have monthly community connection calls for anyone who's a part of the program, and you can learn more about it all at DEIcareer.com.